courtroom felt colder than it should have been. Not because of the air, but because of the silence that hung in the room. Every sound felt louder than normal. Shoes scraping the floor, papers shifting, someone coughing in the back. The woman sat straight on the wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She kept her eyes forward, afraid that if she looked around, her strength would fade. She had been here before, but today felt different. Today felt final. Across the room, the man who used to be her husband sat with confidence. His posture was relaxed. He leaned slightly toward his lawyer, whispering something that made them both nod. They looked prepared, almost calm, as if they already knew how this would end. The woman's lawyer sat beside her, flipping through a thin folder. The papers inside looked tired, worn from being read too many times. There were gaps in those pages. Everyone in the room knew it. Missing details, missing proof, missing voices that should have been heard. The judge entered, and the room stood up as one. When everyone sat again, the woman felt her heart begin to pound. Her mouth went dry. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. She reminded herself to stay quiet, to stay respectful, to not let her emotions show. The hearing resumed where it had left off. The husband's lawyer spoke first. His voice was clear and firm. He repeated points that had already been said many times. He talked about timelines, documents, and agreements. He spoke as if everything was simple, clean, and unquestionable. While he spoke, the woman listened carefully. Each word felt like a small weight pressing down on her chest. Some things were true. Some were twisted. Some were missing important parts. But she stayed silent, just as she had been advised. Then it was her lawyer's turn. He stood and spoke with honesty, but his voice lacked the same strength. He explained the woman's side as best as he could. He mentioned the sacrifices she had made. He spoke about responsibilities she carried alone. He hinted at things that could not be fully proven without certain evidence. The woman wanted to speak. She wanted to explain what those missing details really meant. She wanted to tell the court about the nights she stayed awake worrying, the calls she never made, the truth she kept hidden because she believed staying quiet was safer. But she stayed still. The judge listened without expression. From time to time, notes were written down. Questions were asked, but only a few. The judge looked at the clock, then back at the lawyers. It was clear the patience in the room was running thin. Finally, the judge leaned back and folded his hands. The room became completely silent. He spoke calmly. He said that based on the evidence presented and the facts available to the court, the decision was clear. The ruling would favor the husband. The words hit the woman like a sudden wave. She felt the air leave her lungs. Her hands tightened even more, her fingers pressing into each other until they hurt. She stared ahead, but everything began to blur. She heard murmurs behind her, a quiet sigh of relief from the other side of the room. The judge continued speaking, explaining the decision in legal terms. Property, responsibility, custody matters. Each sentence felt heavier than the last. To the court, it was just another case, another file to be closed. To her, it was her life. She thought of all the moments that led to this point. Times she chose peace over conflict. Times she trusted promises that were never kept. Times she believed the truth would somehow speak for itself. It hadn't. Her lawyer leaned toward her and whispered that they would discuss next steps later. His voice was kind, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from the end of a long hallway. She nodded slightly, even though she barely heard him. The judge prepared to move on to the next case. The clerk reached for the file, ready to close it. That was when the woman felt something shift inside her. A quiet voice in her mind asked a simple question. What if this is not the whole truth? What if something important is still missing? She thought about the phone she had left in her bag. She thought about the call she never expected. The one she had dismissed earlier that morning, believing it was too late for anything to change. Her chest tightened again, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't only fear. It was regret. Around her, people began to stand. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. The husband smiled faintly as he gathered his papers. His lawyer shook his hand. The woman remained seated for a moment longer. She looked up at the judge, who was already turning his attention elsewhere. She wanted to say something, anything, but her voice refused to come out. Years of staying quiet had trained her well. She slowly stood and reached for her bag. As her fingers brushed against her phone, the screen lit up. A missed call. Her heart skipped. She stared at the number, unsure whether it was real or just her imagination. The name attached to it made her breath catch. This was not a random call. This was someone who knew something. Someone who had been absent for reasons beyond her control. She looked around the courtroom, unsure of what to do. The judge was still there. The hearing was not officially closed yet. For the first time in a long while, she hesitated between staying silent and speaking up. Her past told her to stay quiet. Something deeper told her this might be her last chance. She tightened her grip on the phone and took a slow step forward, not knowing yet that this single moment would soon stop everything she believed was already decided. She stepped out of the courtroom slowly, as if the floor beneath her feet might give way. The hallway felt long and narrow, even though it wasn't. People passed by her, some talking, some laughing, some rushing to their own hearings. Life was moving normally for everyone else. For her, it felt like time had paused. She found an empty bench near the wall and sat down. Her bag rested on her knees. Her phone was still in her hand, the screen dark now. That missed call stayed in her mind, like an unanswered question that refused to go away. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. She reminded herself not to cry here. Not now. She had cried enough in private spaces. She didn't want to give this building any more of her tears. Her thoughts drifted back to how everything started. Years earlier, life had felt simpler. She had trusted easily. When problems appeared, she believed they could be solved with patience. She believed that staying calm and quiet was the right way. Whenever arguments grew loud, she chose silence. Whenever choices had to be made, she put others first. That habit followed her into the marriage. She handled things quietly behind the scenes. Bills, schedules, family responsibilities. When mistakes were made, she fixed them without pointing fingers. When promises were broken, she forgave without demanding answers. But silence has a cost. When things finally fell apart, she was not ready for how quickly the story changed. Suddenly, the version of events presented to the court felt unfamiliar. Facts were trimmed down. Moments were rearranged. Her quiet nature was mistaken for agreement. She had tried to explain this to her lawyer many times. She had said there were things that didn't appear on paper. Conversations that happened late at night. Decisions made out of fear, not choice. She had mentioned someone who knew the truth. Someone who had seen what really happened. But that person was hard to reach. At the time, she believed it would be fine. She thought the court would see through the gaps. She thought honesty would be enough. When deadlines passed and evidence was incomplete, she blamed herself but kept moving forward. Now, sitting on that bench, she realized how wrong she had been. Her phone vibrated softly. She froze. Slowly, she lifted the screen. Another call from the same number. Her heart began to beat faster. She didn't answer right away. Fear wrapped around her fingers. What if it was too late? What if hearing this truth now only made things hurt more? The phone stopped ringing. She stared at it, her thumb hovering above the screen. Then, without giving herself time to overthink, she pressed call back. It rang once, then twice. A voice answered. The voice sounded rushed, apologetic. The caller explained they had just learned about the hearing that morning. They had tried reaching her earlier but failed. There was urgency in every word. They said they had information the court needed to hear. She listened in silence as the caller spoke. Each sentence filled in a missing piece. Timelines suddenly made sense. Decisions that looked careless were explained. Choices that seemed selfish were revealed to be forced. Her throat tightened. This was it. This was the truth she had tried to explain but couldn't prove on her own. She looked around the hallway. Court staff moved back and forth. Lawyers discussed cases. Somewhere behind those walls, the judge was still present. The hearing might not be fully closed yet. She asked the caller one simple question. Could you explain this to the court if needed? The answer came without hesitation. Yes. Her heart pounded louder now. Fear mixed with hope in a way she had never felt before. She thanked the caller and ended the call, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, she stayed seated, staring at the floor. This was the moment she always avoided. The moment where she had to interrupt, to speak up, to risk being seen as difficult or dramatic. She remembered all the times she stayed quiet to keep peace. All the times she told herself that speaking up would only make things worse. But today, staying quiet had already cost her everything. She stood up. Each step toward the courtroom felt heavy, but she kept moving. Her lawyer was standing near the doorway, talking to someone. He looked surprised when he saw her returning. She explained quickly, her voice low but steady. She told him about the call, about the information, about the person who was willing to speak. At first, he hesitated. The case had already gone against them. Interrupting now could annoy the judge, could fail. She listened, then spoke in a way she never had before. She said she understood the risk, but she also said she could not walk away knowing the truth was finally within reach. She said this wasn't about winning. It was about being heard. Her lawyer looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. He told her he would try. They waited near the door as the clerk handled paperwork inside. The sounds of another case beginning could already be heard. Time was slipping away. Her lawyer stepped forward and spoke to the clerk, explaining that new information had just come to light. Something relevant. Something serious. The clerk looked unsure. The woman stood quietly behind her lawyer, her heart racing. Every second felt stretched thin. After a short pause, the clerk disappeared into the courtroom. The woman clasped her hands together, her fingers cold now. She stared at the door, barely breathing. This was no longer about fear. This was about truth. If the court refused, she would have to live with that. But if she walked away without trying, she knew the regret would follow her forever. The door opened again. The clerk looked at them and spoke softly. The judge would hear them. Not fully. Not yet. But the hearing would pause. The woman felt her knees weaken with relief. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't even a promise. But it was a chance. As she stepped back into the courtroom, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't shrinking herself to fit the room. She was standing in it. And somewhere on the other end of that phone call, the truth was ready to speak. The courtroom felt different when she stepped back inside. It was the same room, the same wooden benches, the same quiet authority in the air, but something had shifted. People noticed her return. A few heads turned. Someone whispered. The man on the other side looked confused, his relaxed posture stiffening as he saw her standing again. The judge had not left yet. Papers were still spread across the desk. Another case was waiting, but it had not begun. Time seemed to hang in a fragile balance. Her lawyer cleared his throat and spoke calmly, asking the court for a brief pause. He explained that new information had just come to light. Information that directly related to the decision that had just been announced. The judge looked up, clearly surprised. There was a pause, long enough to make the woman's heart race. The judge asked why this information had not been presented earlier. Her lawyer answered honestly. He said the source had been unreachable until that moment. He said the information could affect how the evidence was understood. The judge leaned back slightly, considering. On the other side, the husband's lawyer stood quickly. He objected. He said the case had already been heard. He said reopening it would waste the court's time. He spoke firmly, confident that the ruling would stand. The woman stood quietly, her hands clasped together. She felt every second pass through her body. Her legs felt weak, but she didn't move. The judge raised a hand to stop the arguing. He looked directly at the woman for the first time that day. He asked her if she understood that this might change nothing. She nodded. He asked her if the information was relevant and serious. She nodded again, then spoke softly. She said yes. She said it mattered. Her voice did not shake. The judge studied her for a moment longer. Then he spoke. He said the hearing would pause. Not reopen fully. Just pause long enough to understand what this interruption was about. A quiet wave of sound moved through the room. The clerk approached and asked for the source of the information. Her lawyer explained that the person was available by phone and willing to speak immediately. The judge hesitated. Phone calls were not common in hearings like this. The rules were clear, but so was the responsibility to hear the truth. After a moment, the judge agreed to allow the call. Just briefly, the woman's chest tightened. This was it. The clerk arranged the call. The courtroom grew silent again. Even the man across the room stopped shifting in his seat. When the voice came through, it was clear and direct. The caller identified themselves and explained their connection to the situation. They spoke with care, choosing words carefully, aware of where they were speaking. They described events the court had not heard before. Not opinions, not feelings, just facts. They explained why certain documents were delayed, why certain decisions had been made under pressure, why the timeline presented earlier did not reflect what truly happened. As the caller spoke, the judge took notes. Slowly, carefully, the woman listened, her eyes fixed on the floor. Every sentence felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. Things she had carried alone were finally being said out loud. Across the room, the husband's face changed. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. Confidence gave way to tension. The caller finished speaking and offered to provide proof if given the chance. The judge thanked them and ended the call. Silence filled the room again, but it was no longer empty silence. It was heavy with thought. The judge looked at both lawyers and asked a few direct questions. Short ones, clear ones. The answers did not come as easily this time. The judge then turned to the woman and asked if she wished to add anything. She swallowed and took a breath. She spoke about the fear that had kept her quiet, about believing that patience would protect her. She did not accuse. She did not raise her voice. She simply explained how incomplete facts had shaped the case. She said she was not asking for sympathy. She was asking for fairness. The room felt still as she finished speaking. The judge nodded slowly. He said the court would need time to review what had just been presented. He said the earlier ruling could not stand without reconsideration. The man on the other side stood abruptly. His lawyer spoke again, trying to regain control of the situation, but the certainty was gone. The judge raised his hand once more and spoke firmly. He said the hearing was officially paused. The words echoed. Paused. Not closed. The clerk began collecting documents again, this time with care. The next case would have to wait. The woman felt her knees tremble, but she remained standing. Relief washed over her, slow and deep. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply breathed. As people slowly began to move, the judge looked at her one last time. He reminded her that truth often arrives late, but it still deserves to be heard. She nodded, unable to speak. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt brighter. Not because anything was solved yet, but because hope had returned. Her lawyer walked beside her, already discussing what would come next. Evidence, statements, verification. She listened, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She thought about how close she had been to walking away, how easily this moment could have never happened. One phone call, one choice to speak. The case was no longer over, and for the first time, she believed the truth might finally have its place. The days after the hearing felt longer than the weeks before it. Nothing had been decided yet, but everything felt different. The pause hung over her like a question that refused to be ignored. She woke up early each morning, her mind already racing, replaying the words spoken in the courtroom. She spent hours gathering what she could. Old messages, notes she had written to herself and forgotten, receipts tucked away in drawers. Small details that once seemed unimportant now felt heavy with meaning. She moved slowly, carefully, afraid of missing anything again. Her lawyer called often. His tone had changed. He sounded focused, alert. He asked clear questions and listened closely to her answers. He explained that the court would look closely at the new information. Nothing would be assumed. Everything would be checked. She understood. She welcomed it. For the first time, the process felt fair. The person who had called that day stayed in contact. They shared records and dates. They explained how confusion had spread earlier, how messages had been delayed, how fear had kept people from stepping forward. There was no anger in their voice, only relief that the truth was finally being spoken. The man who had once seemed so confident grew quiet. Through brief exchanges and updates, she could sense the shift. The story he had relied on was no longer standing on solid ground. Questions were being asked. Gaps were being noticed. When the court date returned, the room felt sharper, more alert. Every movement seemed measured. The judge entered with a serious expression, carrying notes thicker than before. The woman sat straight, her hands resting calmly this time. She was still nervous, but fear no longer controlled her. She had learned something important. Speaking up did not make her weak. The hearing resumed. The judge addressed the new material directly. He asked about timelines, about why certain documents were presented late, about who knew what and when. Each question was steady, without judgment. Her lawyer responded clearly. He did not rush. He did not exaggerate. He simply explained. Then the other side was asked to respond. Their answers were slower now, less certain. Words that once sounded confident now felt careful, almost defensive. The room noticed. The judge listened closely. At one point, the judge asked the woman to speak again. Not to defend herself, but to clarify a moment that had been misunderstood earlier. She took a breath and spoke plainly. She explained why she had agreed to something she did not fully understand at the time. She explained the pressure she felt, the fear of conflict, the belief that keeping peace would protect everyone. She did not blame. She explained. The judge nodded. The hearing continued for hours. Breaks were taken. Notes were reviewed. At times, the room felt heavy with silence. At other times, voices overlapped with urgency. Slowly, a clearer picture formed. It was not the simple story that had been presented before. It was complicated, human, full of hesitation and missed chances. But it was real. When the judge finally spoke again, his tone had changed. He said the earlier ruling had been based on incomplete understanding. He said the court now had a responsibility to correct that. The woman felt her breath catch. This was not yet a final decision, but it was acknowledgement. The judge explained that the court would reassess everything. He said fairness required time, patience, and honesty. He reminded everyone that justice was not about speed. It was about truth. The hearing ended for the day. As she stepped outside, the air felt lighter. Not because everything was solved, but because she was no longer invisible. Her voice had weight now. Her lawyer walked beside her, explaining what would happen next. Possible outcomes. Further review. More questions. She listened, nodding. That evening, she sat alone and reflected. She thought about how close she had come to accepting a life shaped by silence. She thought about the version of herself who believed speaking up would only bring trouble. She smiled softly. That version was gone. Whatever the final decision would be, she had already changed. She had chosen courage over comfort, truth over quiet, and for the first time in a long while, she slept without fear of the morning. The final hearing arrived quietly. There was no rush, no loud tension in the hallway. It felt calm in a way that made her nervous. Calm often meant decisions had already been made. She walked into the courtroom with steady steps. This time she did not feel small. She felt present, aware. Whatever happened next, she knew she had done everything she could. The room filled slowly. The man took his seat on the other side, no longer relaxed. His eyes stayed on the table in front of him. Papers were neatly arranged, but his hands moved restlessly. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The usual routine followed, but something in the air felt heavier than before. Final. The judge began by reviewing the case from the beginning. He spoke clearly, going over the early assumptions, the missing details, and the moment everything shifted. He spoke about responsibility, not blame. About understanding, not accusation. She listened carefully, her hands folded in her lap. The judge explained how the new information changed the way earlier evidence had to be seen. He spoke about timelines that now made sense, about choices that were once judged harshly but now appeared reasonable. No one interrupted. The courtroom stayed silent as he spoke. When he finished reviewing, he paused and looked at both sides. He reminded them that courts are meant to serve fairness, not convenience. That silence should never be mistaken for agreement. That truth can arrive late, but it still matters. Then he delivered the final decision. The earlier ruling was reversed. The words landed softly, but their meaning was powerful. The court ruled in her favor. She felt her breath leave her body in one long, quiet release. Her shoulders dropped as if she had been holding the weight of the world without realizing it. For a moment, she could not move. She did not cry. She simply closed her eyes and nodded. Across the room, the man remained still. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something she could not hear. Whatever confidence had once filled that space was gone. The judge continued, explaining the outcome carefully. Adjustments were ordered. Fair terms were outlined. The decision was firm, but respectful. This was not punishment. This was correction. When it was over, the judge wished them both well and reminded them that the court's role was not to decide who was good or bad, but to ensure justice was done. The hearing ended. People stood and gathered their things. Quiet conversations filled the room. Papers were placed into folders. Another case would follow. For the world, it was just another day in court. For her, it was the end of a long chapter. Outside, sunlight spilled across the steps of the building. She stood there for a moment, letting it warm her face. The noise of the city moved around her. Cars passed. Voices echoed. Life continued. Her lawyer congratulated her gently. He told her she had been brave. She thanked him, but the words felt too small to capture what she felt. Bravery had not felt like strength. It had felt like fear mixed with honesty. As she walked away, she thought about how close she had come to accepting a future shaped by silence. How easily this ending could have been different. One phone call had changed everything. But more than that, one decision to speak. She realized something important as she moved forward. The court had not given her power. She had taken it back herself. Not by fighting, not by shouting, but by telling the truth. That evening, she returned home and sat in the quiet. No rush. No noise, just stillness. She placed her phone on the table and looked at it for a long moment. It was just an object, but it reminded her that life can turn on the smallest moments. She smiled softly, not out of victory, but relief. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Healing would take time. Trust would not return overnight. But tonight, she allowed herself peace. The kind that comes from knowing your voice was finally heard.